Okay, let's go. Number 1. Silphium. The year is 2023. In a herbarium room at the University of Ankara, a botanist named Mahmut Miski is holding a pressed specimen of Ferula drudaiana, a species of giant fennel native to a narrow belt of Turkish highland. He is holding it carefully, the way you hold something you are not sure is what you think it is. For several years, Miski and his colleagues have been making a specific argument that Ferula drudaiana may be a surviving relative, possibly a direct descendant, of a plant that has not been reliably documented in the wild since the reign of the Emperor Nero, a plant that, for 6 centuries, was more valuable per gram than silver. A plant that grew in one place on Earth and nowhere else, was harvested to commercial extinction before the 2nd century of the Common Era, and whose medical properties have never been systematically studied by modern pharmacology, because there is nothing left to study. It was called Silphium. It grew exclusively along a narrow coastal strip of what is now northeastern Libya, in the territory of ancient Cyrene. The city of Cyrene built its entire economic identity around it. The plant appeared on one face of Cyrenian coinage for centuries, the only commodity so central to a city's survival that the city minted it into its money. Greek and Roman physicians documented its uses in detail. The Hippocratic corpus references Silphium for respiratory conditions, digestive ailments, and fever management. Pliny the Elder's Naturalis Historia, compiled in 77 CE, catalogues its applications across reproductive medicine, joint pain, and wound treatment. It was used as a contraceptive, as an abortifacient, as a febrifuge and an anti-inflammatory. The Roman appetite for Silphium was not gradual. Julius Caesar, when he seized the Roman treasury in 49 BCE, confiscated 340 kilograms of Silphium root from the imperial reserve, a single commodity held alongside gold and silver as a strategic asset of the state. To put that in proportion, Roman medical writers considered Silphium root, by weight, among the most valuable substances a physician could hold. The demand that created that stockpile drove harvesting at a rate the plant's limited coastal range could not sustain. Wild Silphium grew in a strip of land estimated at no more than a few hundred kilometers of Libyan coastline. It did not appear to transplant successfully. Attempts by Cyrene to cultivate it outside its native range appear to have failed, based on the complete absence of any Roman-era account of Silphium grown elsewhere. By the 1st century CE, Pliny recorded that the last known specimen of genuine Silphium had been sent to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity, not as medicine, not as commerce, as a strange artifact of a thing that used to exist. Modern pharmacological analysis of Ferula species, the genus to which Silphium almost certainly belonged, has confirmed what the ancient prescriptions implied. Marie-Louise Bott and colleagues, publishing in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology in 1986, documented the anti-implantation activity of ferrujol, a compound present in multiple Ferula species, in controlled mammalian studies. Subsequent work identified sesquiterpene coumarins in the same genus with confirmed anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial activity. The related species work. The chemistry is there. Whether the original Silphium carried the same compounds at the same concentrations remains unknown, because the original Silphium no longer exists. We know it worked. The Roman medical establishment used it for 6 centuries. We cannot study it. The plant was consumed into oblivion before anyone thought to ask how, precisely, it did what it did. Miski's Ferula drudaiana is close, phylogenetically close, geographically suggestive, chemically promising, but close is not the thing itself. And the thing itself was used to death by the civilization that depended on it most. Some researchers ask what it means that Rome's most widely used pharmaceutical commodity was also its most aggressively overexploited, and whether Silphium represents the first documented case of an empire destroying a medicine it had not yet learned to replace. Number 2. The Library of Alexandria. The year is 2024. In a conservation laboratory in Oxford, a researcher is feeding a fragment of carbonized papyrus, one of the Herculaneum scrolls, into a multispectral imaging array. The text emerging from the scan has not been read since Vesuvius buried it in 79 CE. What is being recovered, letter by letter, is a philosophical treatise on pleasure. The researchers working on it know that other scrolls in the same collection, the ones whose outer layers were too badly damaged to unwrap, may contain medical texts. They will not know until they look. The technology to look without destroying the scroll now exists. The funding to apply it systematically does not. The Library of Alexandria, at its height, held an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, a figure derived from Tzetzes writing in the 12th century and Orosius writing in the 5th, both working from sources now lost. Historian Luciano Canfora, in The Vanished Library, published in 1989, reconstructed the medical holdings from secondary references, citations in surviving texts that point toward originals now gone. The library held what appears to have been the complete original corpus of Hippocrates, not the selected texts transmitted through Byzantine copying, but the full archive, including pharmacological preparation texts that no longer exist in any known collection. It held the full original of Dioscorides de Materia Medica. What we possess today is a 6th century Byzantine copy of a copy, with identifiable errors suggesting the copyists worked from already damaged manuscripts. Galen is the most precise testimony to the scale of the loss. Writing in the 2nd century CE in De Compositione Medicamentorum, a text that did survive, he describes compound pharmaceutical formulas he is transcribing from sources he names, and that he explicitly fears may not survive him. He was right. The sources he cited are gone. What remains is Galen's transcription of fragments of what they contained, without the methodology, without the supplementary material, and without the context he assumes his reader possesses, because he assumes they have access to the originals. The fire of 48 BCE was not the end. In 391 CE, the Christian emperor Theophilus ordered the destruction of the Silphium, the library's largest daughter institution. Theophilus confirmed this in his own surviving correspondence. In 642 CE, with the Arab conquest of Alexandria, whatever remained of the city's accumulated collections, already reduced, already copied incompletely across 3 centuries of political upheaval, was lost again. Not one fire. A slow hemorrhage across 7 centuries of successive powers who did not consider their predecessors' knowledge worth preserving. The specific medical loss matters because the texts that did survive contain explicit references to works that should follow them. Pharmacological appendices, compound preparation guides, the volumes a physician would need to actually execute the treatments described. They don't exist. We have the titles. We have Galen noting, in 170 CE, that he hoped someone would copy what he was copying from, because he could not be certain it would endure. It did not endure. Some historians ask not whether we could have preserved it, but whether the civilization that destroyed it understood what it was destroying, and whether, 1,600 years later, we have found a better answer to the question of who decides which knowledge survives. Number 3. The Aztec Pharmacopoeia. The year is 1552. An Aztec physician named Martín de la Cruz, working at the Colegio de Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco in the city the Spanish had renamed Mexico City, dictated a medical manuscript in Nahuatl to a student named Juan Badiano, who translated it into Latin. The manuscript, now called the Badianus manuscript, or the Codex Barberini, describes 184 plants organized by the conditions they treat: fever, heart disease, fatigue, infected wounds, difficult childbirth, conditions of the eyes, conditions of the blood. De la Cruz was not inventing this knowledge. He was transcribing a tradition that had been accumulating for centuries, one that had survived the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan in 1521, and that he understood, in 1552, might not survive much longer. He was right. The Badianus manuscript is the only surviving pre-Columbian Mesoamerican medical text. It is a remnant. The libraries it came from had already been burned. Bishop Diego de Landa burned 27 Mayan codices at Mani in the Yucatan on July 12, 1562. He recorded this himself in his Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, written in 1566. We found a large number of books in these characters, and, as they contained nothing in which were not to be seen as superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree, and which caused them much affliction. 27 books, centuries of accumulated medical knowledge, reduced to ash in an afternoon. De Landa documented the destruction in his own hand and kept writing. Francisco Hernandez, personal physician to King Philip II of Spain, spent 7 years, from 1570 to 1577, traveling through New Spain, cataloging the region's plant pharmacology. He documented more than 3,000 plant species with their Nahuatl names, their preparation methods, and their documented applications. His complete manuscript was delivered to the royal archives at the Escorial Palace in Spain. In 1671, a fire destroyed the Escorial Library. The complete Hernandez manuscript was lost. An abridged version, prepared by Francisco Ximenez in 1615, survives. It represents, by Ximenez's own account, a fraction of the original. The Badianus manuscript was sent to Rome as a gift for Cardinal Francesco Barberini in 1552. It passed through European private collections before entering the Vatican Apostolic Library, where it remained undisturbed and inaccessible to the people whose tradition it documented until Pope John Paul II returned it to Mexico in 1990. 438 years in a Vatican archive. Modern pharmacological analysis of the plants it lists has confirmed bioactive properties in approximately 60% of the species, documented by Robert By and Edelmira Linares in Economic Botany in 1986, and extended by Michael Heinrich and colleagues in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology in 2006. The plants include treatments for cardiac arrhythmia, wound infection, and inflammatory fever, conditions for which Western medicine developed pharmaceutical solutions only in the 20th century. The knowledge existed in 1552. The bishop burned the libraries it lived in. The one manuscript that escaped did so because it was sent abroad. Some historians ask whether the destruction of the Aztec pharmacopoeia delayed the pharmacological discovery of compounds that could have been in clinical use for centuries earlier, and who bears the accounting for that delay. Number 4. Byzantine Theriac. The year is 1745. In the Piazza San Marco in Venice, a ceremony is being conducted that has been repeated in some form every year for nearly 9 centuries. Physicians, apothecaries, and civic officials gather to witness the preparation of theriac, the compound medicine that Venice had manufactured and certified since approximately the 9th century. The ceremony of 1745 produced the last documented batch of genuine Venetian theriac. After that year, there is no confirmed record of preparation by a practitioner trained in the tradition. The guild dissolved. The masters, who had memorized the proportions, the sequence of preparation across weeks of careful work, were gone. The formula survived on paper. What died was the understanding of how to make it work. Theriac's origins trace to Mithridates VI of Pontus in the 1st century BCE, the king who, terrified of assassination by poison, spent years testing antidote compounds on condemned prisoners and consumed a daily prophylactic formula of his own design. The physician Galen systematized the preparation in De Antidotis in the 2nd century CE. By Galen's account, the fully developed theriac contained 64 ingredients: viper flesh, opium, honey, castoreum, and dozens of botanical compounds including cinnamon, saffron, gentian, and iris root. It was prescribed as antidote to poison, treatment for snakebite, and a remedy for what Galen called pestilential fever, a category whose clinical description maps, in retrospect, to the symptoms of several epidemic infectious diseases. Venice became the medicine's primary European producer during the medieval period, establishing a quality certification system that historian Michael Doles documented in The Black Death in the Middle East in 1977 as commanding prices across Mediterranean trade networks comparable to luxury. Spices. A certified batch of Venetian theriac was sold as far as the Islamic world, where it was called Tiryak Farouk and referenced in Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine. For 1,700 years, across the Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, and European medical traditions, some version of this compound was in continuous production, and then it wasn't. Brian Morell and Peter Houghton at the School of Pharmacy, University of London, published a pharmacological analysis in Pharmacy and History in 1999. Their findings: several of theriac's 64 ingredients, including Acorus calamus and certain ferula compounds, possess confirmed antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. The opium component provided genuine analgesic and antidiarrheal effects that would have been clinically meaningful in infectious disease management. A preparation containing a functional analgesic, multiple antimicrobials, and anti-inflammatory agents, administered to patients presenting with fever and intestinal symptoms, would have had measurable therapeutic effects even by modern pharmacological standards. What has never been studied is the compound effect. 64 ingredients acting together at specific proportions, prepared through a specific sequence accumulated over centuries of professional practice. That study cannot be conducted. The precise weights, the preparation order, the knowledge of which stages required, which conditions, these were held in the experiential memory of trained practitioners. Not in any written document comprehensive enough to reconstruct the process. The formula exists in Galen, but Galen's text is a description, not a recipe. The practitioners who held the tacit knowledge were the formula's actual repository. When the Venetian Guild dissolved, that repository closed permanently. Some pharmacologists now ask whether the centuries-long clinical record of Theriac as a treatment for pestilential fever represents observational evidence of genuine compound efficacy, and whether any research institution would fund the study required to find out. Number 5. The Ebers Papyrus. The year is 1873. A German Egyptologist named Georg Ebers purchases a papyrus scroll from an antiquities dealer in Luxor. The seller claims it was found between the legs of a mummy in the Asasif necropolis at Thebes. Ebers unrolls it carefully. What he is holding is 110 columns of hieratic script covering approximately 20 meters of papyrus written around 1550 BCE. It describes 700 medical remedies, preparations for infected wounds, fever, intestinal disease, eye conditions, cardiac symptoms, and neurological pain. The measurements are specific. The preparation methods are precise. The application frequencies are given. The physicians who wrote this had been practicing for a long time. Their text does not read like incantation. It reads like a pharmacopoeia. Egyptologist Lise Maniche, in An Ancient Egyptian Herbal, published in 1989, analyzed the plant-based remedies in the Ebers Papyrus and related Egyptian medical texts, cross-referencing ancient Egyptian plant names with modern pharmacological classifications. Tapsoba and colleagues, publishing in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology in 2011, confirmed bioactive properties in approximately 30% of the Ebers remedies, a figure that represents the floor, not the ceiling, since many species referenced cannot yet be identified with certainty from their ancient Egyptian names alone. Among the most documented, the honey wound dressing. The Ebers Papyrus prescribes honey applied directly to infected wounds, changed at regular intervals. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, an Egyptian surgical text of similar antiquity, makes the same recommendation. Honey as wound treatment appears repeatedly across Egyptian medical writing of the period. For the following 2,000 years, this tradition was classified successively as folk practice, superstition, and pre-scientific ritual, part of an empirical tradition that the Greek medical tradition, with its theoretical framework of humoral medicine, had superseded. When Greek physicians offered explanations for why treatments worked and Egyptian physicians offered only careful observation that they did, the Greek model became the canonical tradition. Egyptian empiricism was folded into the category of mythology. Peter Molin at the University of Waikato documented the mechanism in Bee World in 1992. Honey's antibacterial efficacy derives from hydrogen peroxide production during dilution, low water activity, suppressing microbial growth, low pH, and in certain honeys, particularly leptospermum-derived varieties, the additional antibacterial compound methylglyoxal. In 2007, the United States Food and Drug Administration approved Manuka honey as a clinical wound dressing. The year of that approval was 3,457 years after the Ebers Papyrus described the same prescription. Copper tells the same story. The Ebers Papyrus references copper salts for wound infection. Copper's oligodynamic bactericidal properties, its ability to kill pathogens on contact, are now standard in hospital infection control. Copper-lined surfaces in intensive care units are a documented intervention for reducing healthcare-associated infections. The mechanism was not discovered in the 20th century. It was rediscovered. The Egyptian physicians had found it empirically, through observation, repetition, and the kind of practical knowledge accumulation that takes generations, and documented it in a text that then spent 3,400 years being classified as magic. Some researchers ask what the humoral theory cost. Not in terms of intent, the Greek physicians believed in their framework sincerely, but in terms of the empirical treatments abandoned because they could not be explained by a model that turned out to be wrong. Number 6. The Inca Pharmacopoeia. The year is 2017. A team at Harvard, led by researcher Sabine Hyland, publishes a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences presenting the first evidence that certain Andean quipus, the knotted string records used by the Inca, encode not just numerical data but phonetic values. That some quipus are, in a meaningful sense, text. The discovery rewrites the assumption that the Inca had no writing system. It also raises a question. Researchers in the field began asking immediately, if quipus carry language, what language do the medical ones carry? Because there were medical quipus. The Hampi Kamiak, the specialist class of Inca physicians, documented by Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala in his 1,200-page chronicle Nueva Crónica y Buen Gobierno, written for the King of Spain in 1615, maintained records of their practice. Some of those records may be knotted into quipus that still exist in museum collections, unread and unrecognized as text. The Toledo Ordinances of 1570 changed what would survive. Viceroy Francisco de Toledo ordered the systematic identification and prosecution of all indigenous ritual specialists. The Hampi Kamiak, whose medical practice combined pharmacological knowledge with ritual context, as did every major ancient medical tradition, were categorized as practitioners of idolatry. Their specialists were targeted. Their oral transmission lineages, which required years of formal apprenticeship, were interrupted by prosecution and death. The knowledge they carried was not written down. It was held in living memory and transmitted person to person. When the transmission chain broke, it broke permanently. The extent of what was lost becomes measurable through what archaeology has subsequently confirmed the Inca knew. John Verano, at Tulane University, publishing in Studies in Pre-Columbian Art and Archaeology in 1997, analyzed skeletal evidence from pre-Columbian trepanation. Post-operative bone regrowth, consistent with patient survival, appeared in approximately 60 to 80% of cases examined. European trepanation through the 18th century carried survival rates of 30 to 50%. Inca surgeons, using obsidian tools and techniques developed over centuries of accumulated practice, were achieving surgical outcomes that Western medicine would not match for 300 years after their tradition was prohibited. The pharmacological lineage runs further still. The Inca used coca leaf, Erythroxylum coca, as a local analgesic and an endurance compound for surgical preparation. Spanish colonial authorities categorized its use as idolatrous and sought to restrict it. Albert Niemann isolated cocaine from coca leaf in 1860. Carl Koller demonstrated cocaine's efficacy as a local anesthetic in 1884. Procaine was synthesized in 1905 as a safer analog. Lidocaine followed in 1943. Every local anesthetic used in modern medicine, every injection that makes a dental procedure painless, descends chemically from a compound the Inca used and that the colonial medical system classified as superstition. Cinchona bark tells the same story at a different angle. The Andean use of cinchona to treat what the Spanish called intermittent fever, almost certainly malaria, was documented by Jesuit missionaries in the 1630s and eventually adopted by European medicine as quinine. The knowledge was not discovered by European pharmacology. It was taken from Andean practitioners who had been legally prohibited from practicing the medicine they had developed. Some historians ask not merely what the Toledo Ordinances destroyed, but whether any reckoning for that destruction, measured in lives, in suffering, in delayed pharmacological knowledge, has ever been formally attempted. Number 7. Hildegard of Bingen. The year is 1150. In the Benedictine monastery of Disibodenberg in the Rhineland, a woman named Hildegard is writing what will become the most comprehensive medical text produced in Western Europe in the 12th century. The work is called Physica. It runs to 9 books. It documents the medicinal properties of plants, trees, stones, fish, birds, animals, reptiles, and metals, categorized by condition, cross-referenced by preparation method, and organized with a systematic logic that has no equivalent in any other surviving European text of the period. Hildegard was not writing theology. She was writing a pharmacopoeia. How much of it survives, and in what form, is one of the more specific and measurable tragedies in the history of medicine. What we have of Physica is fragmentary. The copies made of it in the following centuries were produced by male ecclesiastical scribes, whose priorities were theological rather than pharmacological, who did not always understand what they were copying, and who made choices about what to include and omit that were not neutral. Historian Joan Cadden, in Meanings of Sex Difference in the Middle Ages, published by Cambridge University Press in 1993, documented the systematic pattern. Sections of medieval women's medical texts dealing with reproductive health, gynecological conditions, and management of difficult childbirth were disproportionately omitted, abbreviated, or altered in later manuscript copies. The sections most relevant to the clinical depth of Hildegard's practice were precisely the sections that scribes most consistently failed to transmit intact. Hildegard's surviving descriptions of plant preparations for fever, digestive disorders, and inflammatory conditions have drawn sustained pharmacological attention in recent decades. Several plants she documents, feverfew, Melissa officinalis preparations, and specific aloe vera compounds, have confirmed bioactive properties that align with her stated applications. The mechanisms she could not describe, the biochemistry was 800 years in her future, the effects she described have been confirmed. But the complete pharmacological picture of her gynecological practice is gone, not burned, quietly omitted, generation by copyists who found those sections inappropriate. The broader tradition Hildegard worked within was not suppressed only through copying bias. The Malleus Maleficarum, compiled by Heinrich Kramer in 1486, and the authoritative text on witch identification for courts across Europe, is explicit. Healing through plant preparations, without formal institutional authorization, is listed among the diagnostic markers of witchcraft. The women described in European trial records as healers, women who maintained, through observation and transmission, generations of accumulated plant pharmacology, were in the same prosecutorial category as women accused of weatherworking and poisoning. The distinction the courts made was not between healing and harm. It was between authorized practice and unauthorized practice. Historian Anne Barstow, in Witch Craze, published in 1994, estimated total executions in the European witch trials from 1450 to 1750 at between 40,000 and 60,000 individuals. A significant proportion, the exact figure varies by region and cannot be quantified with precision, were village healers. Practitioners who, across generations, had accumulated empirical plant pharmacology through the same process that produced the Ebers papyrus: observation, repetition, transmission. That knowledge was oral. It was never written down. It died with the people who held it, and no archive can recover it. Some researchers ask what portion of that destroyed knowledge represented genuine pharmacological discovery, not folk belief, but working medicine, and whether the number of lives lost to treatments that didn't exist yet belongs in the same accounting as the executions themselves. Number 8. Dioscorides and the Garden at Herculaneum. The year is 1752. Tunnelers working for the Bourbon King of Naples break through the hardened volcanic matrix beneath the town of Resina and enter a room they were not expecting, a library. The room belongs to the Villa dei Papyri at Herculaneum, buried under approximately 20 meters of pyroclastic material when Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE. The library contains approximately 1,800 scrolls of carbonized papyrus, mostly Epicurean philosophical texts belonging to the school of the philosopher Philodemus of Gadara. The villa itself, based on ground-penetrating surveys conducted between 1996 and 2011 by the Herculaneum Conservation Project, is substantially larger than the tunnelers reached. 2 floors, a fish pond, colonnaded gardens, and at least 4 rooms in the eastern wing whose contents remain unknown. The tunnelers noted these spaces. They documented them. They did not excavate them. In 2023, less than 25% of the Villa dei Papyri had been uncovered. The excavation has been suspended intermittently since the 18th century. Pedanius Dioscorides was a Greek physician working in the Roman military in the 1st century CE. His De Materia Medica, compiled around 77 CE, described approximately 600 plant species, 35 animal products, and 90 mineral substances with their medicinal applications, the most comprehensive pharmacological survey of the ancient world, used as the primary reference text in European and Islamic medicine for 15 centuries. The text we possess is not Dioscorides' text. What we have is the Vienna Dioscorides, a manuscript produced in Constantinople in 512 CE as a gift for the daughter of a Roman general, now held in the Austrian National Library. It is a copy of a copy. Its plant illustrations, while extraordinary as art objects, contain identifiable errors. Plants labeled with names that do not match their described characteristics. Species confused with closely related species, consistent with copyists working from earlier manuscripts that were already damaged. Dioscorides, in the surviving text, refers to supplementary volumes, a companion work on poisonous plants, a separate guide on the preparation of compound medicines, and a set of pharmacological observations he considers too technical for the main text's general readership. None of these supplementary volumes exist in any known collection. They are referenced in footnotes to a text that is itself already a copy of a copy. Wilhelmina Jastrzębski's foundational work, The Gardens of Pompeii, published in 1979, established that Roman garden archaeology, systematic recovery of plant remains, root cavities, and soil pollen from volcanic matrix could identify ancient cultivated species with high confidence. Subsequent work by Andrew Wallace Hadrill and the Herculaneum Conservation Project applied these methods to the accessible portions of the Villa dei Papyri grounds. Carbonized botanical remains from those areas show evidence of systematic medicinal plant cultivation. Species consistent with pharmaceutical use documented in Roman-era texts, planted in organized beds rather than decorative arrangements. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the villa's unexcavated eastern wing have identified a room containing ceramic vessel assemblages consistent with pharmaceutical preparation, the same vessel typology documented at confirmed Roman apothecary sites elsewhere in the region. The surveys also identified what appear to be storage structures adjacent to the garden that may contain preserved plant material in conditions similar to those that preserved the papyri. The room has not been opened. Funding constraints, competing conservation priorities, the extreme technical difficulty of working in partially consolidated volcanic matrix without damaging the structures above. The Italian Ministry of Culture has prioritized structural consolidation of already excavated areas before extending the dig. These are not irrational decisions. They are also, in aggregate, a decision not to look. We know what is there. We are not digging. Some archaeologists ask whether the political and institutional decisions that have kept large portions of Herculaneum unexcavated for 270 years will eventually be recognized as a choice, and whether future generations will judge that choice the way we judge the bishops who burned the codices and the viceroys who dissolved the guilds. Number 9. Neolithic and Bronze Age plant medicine. The year is 1991. A pair of hikers in the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy discover a frozen body protruding from a retreating glacier. The body is approximately 5,300 years old. Forensic and archaeological analysis of the remains, now held at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, has produced one of the most detailed portraits of a single prehistoric individual in the archaeological record. His last meals, his tools, the arrows in his quiver, the parasites in his intestines, and the medicines in his kit. Among his possessions, carried on leather cords attached to his equipment, were 2 lumps of birch polypore fungus, Fomitopsis betulina. The fungus has no nutritional value. He was not carrying it to eat. Luigi Capasso, publishing in The Lancet in 1998, argued that the birch polypore specimens were carried deliberately as medicine, a conclusion supported by the specificity of the species, its confirmed medical properties, and the deliberate manner of its attachment to Ötzi's gear rather than incidental presence among food remains. Ulrike Peintner and colleagues, publishing in Mycological Research the same year, had already documented the pharmacological activity of Fomitopsis betulina, confirmed antibacterial effects against Mycobacterium tuberculosis, Helicobacter pylori, and intestinal parasites. Ötzi himself carried evidence of intestinal parasitic infection, Trichuris trichiura, the whipworm, detectable in his gut contents. A man with intestinal parasites, carrying a fungus with confirmed antiparasitic activity on a journey through high alpine terrain 5,300 years ago. The inference requires no further argument. Ötzi is the most documented case. He is not the most ancient. In 1960, archaeologist Ralph Selecki excavated a Neanderthal burial at Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, dating to approximately 60,000 BCE. In the soil around the individual designated Shanidar 4, Selecki's team found pollen concentrations from 8 plant species, including yarrow, groundsel, grape hyacinth, and ephedra. He published the interpretation in Shanidar, the first flower people in 1971, that the plants had been placed deliberately, possibly as medicinal offerings. The interpretation has been challenged. Jeffrey Levi Fox, in a 1998 paper in Current Anthropology, argued the pollen concentrations were more consistent with burrowing rodent activity than deliberate human placement. The debate has not been resolved. But ephedra was in the cave. Ephedra contains ephedrine, the compound from which modern bronchodilators and decongestants, including pseudoephedrine, are synthesized. Whether its presence reflects deliberate pharmacological knowledge or rodent caching remains contested. That the compound existed at a Neanderthal habitation site 60,000 years before the first written medical text does not. Northern European bog bodies extend the evidence into the Bronze and Iron Ages. The preserved intestinal contents of Tolland Man, Grauballe Man, and several other Danish bog burials analyzed by Peter Glob in The Bog People in 1969 show patterns of plant consumption that cannot be explained nutritionally. Specific plants with no caloric value but confirmed pharmacological activity appear in gut contents, suggesting deliberate ingestion for medical or ritual purposes. Mariche van der Veen at the University of Leicester has spent decades developing the methodology for recovering pre-literary plant use from pollen, phytoliths, and macrobotanical remains at archaeological sites. The interpretive challenge is honest. A plant at a burial is not always a medicine. But across all the evidence, the birch polypore at Ötzi's belt, the ephedra in the Neanderthal grave, the pharmacological plants in the bog bodies, the cumulative picture is not one of accident. Some researchers ask not what we have recovered from pre-literary medicine, but what we have not yet looked for, and how much remains recoverable in frozen bodies and waterlogged peat and volcanic mud, if someone asks the question before the glaciers finish retreating. Number 10. Ayurveda. Traditional Chinese Medicine and the Nobel Prize. The year is 2015. Yu Tu stands in Stockholm to receive the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, the first Chinese scientist to win the award. The prize committee's citation describes her discovery of artemisinin as one of the most significant contributions to tropical medicine in the 20th century. Tu's team at the China Academy of Traditional Chinese Medicine had isolated the compound in 1972 during a secret military research program. The formula they followed came from the Zhouhao Beiji Fang, a medical handbook compiled by the physician Ge Hong in the 4th century CE. The formula had been in a written text for 1,700 years. It had never been subjected to modern pharmacological investigation. When it was, it produced a Nobel Prize and a compound that the World Health Organization estimates saves between 1 and 2 million lives annually. For 4 decades before Stockholm, a 4th century Chinese formula was doing this work, while Western pharmacological institutions treated the tradition that produced it as insufficiently rigorous to study. The colonial exclusion of Asian medical traditions was not accidental. When British colonial administration established the Medical Registration Acts in India in the late 19th century, Ayurvedic practitioners, who held a 2,500-year pharmacological tradition documented in the Sushruta Samhita and the Karaka Samhita, were classified as unlicensed healers. The framework that categorized them this way served the interests of colonial medical authority and Western pharmaceutical commerce. In China, the modernizing Kuomintang government proposed the complete abolition of traditional Chinese medicine in 1929, a proposal defeated by a vote of 23 to 11 in the Committee of the Ministries. The compounds being confirmed now are not peripheral discoveries. Berberine, an alkaloid from Coptis chinensis, documented in the Bencao Gangmu compiled by Li Shizhen in 1596 CE, has been confirmed effective for type 2 diabetes management across multiple clinical trials, with results published by Zhang and colleagues in Diabetes Care in 2008 and confirmed in subsequent meta-analyses. It has also shown activity against certain antibiotic-resistant bacterial strains. It was not studied by Western pharmacology until the 1980s, despite 400 years of documentation in Chinese medical texts. What remains systematically understudied is the compound formula. Both Ayurveda and traditional Chinese medicine operate primarily through multi-herb preparations, dozens of ingredients combined at specific ratios, with the therapeutic effect emerging from the interaction of the combination rather than any single constituent. The Western pharmaceutical research model, built around single-molecule isolation and individual compound trials, cannot efficiently evaluate a preparation in which the active principle may be an interaction between 5 of 30 ingredients. The methodology mismatch means an entire category of potential therapeutic knowledge has not been adequately investigated, not because it was studied and found lacking, but because the research framework to evaluate it did not exist until recently. In 2019, the World Health Organization incorporated traditional Chinese medicine diagnostic categories into the International Classification of Diseases, 11th revision. A critical editorial in the BMJ by David Gorski and colleagues argued the inclusion risked legitimizing unverified practices. The debate reflects a genuine tension. It also reflects the fact that the same institution now incorporating TCM failed to investigate the tradition that produced artemisinin for the entire century, during which artemisinin was saving millions of lives. Across all 10 items on this list, the pattern holds. Medicines consumed to extinction, burned by bishops, buried under ash, executed with their practitioners, quietly omitted by scribes, classified as superstition by the civilization that needed them most. The knowledge was not always lost to fire. Sometimes it was lost to the decision that it wasn't worth keeping. If this kind of history matters to you, subscribe, leave a comment on which of these losses you found most significant, and tell us where in the world you're watching from.